If you were born in the 1970s or 1980s, let me ask you something quietly, almost privately. Do you ever feel like you grew up too fast, but somehow still carry unfinished emotional business inside you? Like you learned responsibility early, learned to stay strong, learned to survive, but no one ever taught you how to rest emotionally. In my consultation room, I often see women from this generation pause mid-sentence. They smile, then their eyes soften, and they say something like, "I don't know why I feel tired all the time. I did everything right." What most people don't realize is this. Being born in the 70s and 80s shaped your nervous system in a very specific way. Not because of who you are, but because of the world that raised you. You grew up during transition, no smartphones, no emotional language, no mental health vocabulary. Love was shown through sacrifice, not words. Stress was normalized. Silence was strength. From a psychological perspective, this generation, especially women, developed what we call adaptive hyperfunctioning. Your brain learned early that being capable meant being safe. Helping others meant being valued. Holding it together meant being loved. This isn't personality, this is conditioning. The female brain is wired for connection, emotional attunement, and relational safety. But many women born in these decades were taught to override those instincts, to not need too much, to not feel too deeply, to not ask, just manage. Neurologically, that creates a constant low-grade stress response. Your amygdala stays slightly alert. Your body learns to anticipate problems before they happen. You call it intuition, but often it's unresolved vigilance. This is something no one warns you about. You become excellent at coping, but disconnected from softness. You know how to endure, but not how to receive. Emotionally, many of you learn to self-soothe through productivity. Doing replaces feeling. Achievement replaces rest. Control replaces safety. And here's the uncomfortable truth. You were praised for being strong, but strength was often your survival strategy, not your choice. In therapy, when I gently ask, when did you last feel emotionally held? There is often a long silence. That silence matters. Because understanding your psychology is not about blame. It's about finally giving language to what your nervous system has been carrying for decades. And this is only the beginning. In my consultation, I often see women born in the 1970s and 1980s struggle with something they can't quite name. They are not unhappy in the obvious sense. They have families, careers, responsibilities. But there is a quiet emotional flatness they describe as something missing. What most people don't realize is that this generation grew up emotionally unsupervised. Parents were present physically, but emotionally distracted by survival, finances, societal pressure. Feelings were not explored, they were managed. If you were sad, you were told to be strong. If you were angry, you were told to be grateful. If you were scared, you were told not to overreact. From a developmental psychology standpoint, this creates what we call emotional self-reliance too early in life. The child learns, my emotions are my responsibility alone. And that belief doesn't disappear with age. It matures into emotional isolation. Neuroscience shows us that when emotional expression is repeatedly discouraged, the brain's emotional regulation systems adapt. The prefrontal cortex learns to suppress emotional signals coming from the limbic system. You don't stop feeling, you just stop noticing. This is why many women from this generation say things like, I don't cry easily, or I stay calm in crises, or I don't like depending on anyone. These are not flaws, they are adaptations. But adaptations come with consequences. One consequence is difficulty receiving care. Compliments feel uncomfortable. Support feels intrusive. Rest feels unproductive. Another consequence is delayed emotional processing. You might hold it together for years, and then suddenly feel overwhelmed by something small. A comment, a memory, a moment of quiet. This confuses many women. They think something is wrong with them. Nothing is wrong. Your nervous system simply never learned how to safely release emotion in real time. In relationships, this often shows up as emotional guardedness. You love deeply, but cautiously. You give, but you calculate the cost. You want closeness, but fear dependence. This internal conflict is exhausting. And here is something I say gently, but honestly, in therapy. Your independence may have protected you once, but it may now be preventing intimacy. This is something no one warns you about. Being emotionally strong can quietly turn into emotional loneliness. Healing for this generation is not about becoming softer overnight. It's about retraining the nervous system to feel safe receiving, expressing, and resting without guilt. And that process requires awareness first. Which brings us to the deeper emotional patterns this generation carries into adulthood. In my consultation room, there is a pattern I see again and again in women born in the 1970s and 1980s. They are deeply empathetic. They read rooms effortlessly. They sense shifts in tone, mood, and energy before a word is spoken. And yet, they often struggle to understand their own needs. This is not a contradiction. It is a developmental outcome. Many women from this generation grew up learning to monitor others to stay emotionally safe. You learned who was stressed, who needed support, who to avoid upsetting. From a neurological perspective, this trains the brain's mirror neuron system to stay hyper-attuned to others. You become excellent at emotional perception, outward, not inward. Over time, your emotional compass points away from yourself. This is why so many women say, "I don't know what I want," or "I'm fine with whatever," or "It doesn't matter." But it does matter. You just weren't taught to prioritize it. What most people don't realize is that chronic self-neglect doesn't feel dramatic. It feels normal. You become the reliable one, the listener, the fixer. Your identity becomes useful, and usefulness can quietly replace authenticity. In relationships, this often leads to emotional imbalance. You give more emotional labor. You carry the unspoken weight. You anticipate needs that were never voiced. At first, this feels like love. Later, it feels like resentment. I often hear women say, with genuine confusion, "I don't understand why I'm so tired of everyone. It's because your nervous system is doing invisible work all the time." This generation also learned to suppress anger, especially women. Anger was labeled as disrespectful, dramatic, or ungrateful, so it went underground. Psychologically, suppressed anger doesn't disappear. It turns into chronic tension, irritability, migraines, jaw clenching, digestive issues, emotional numbness. The body keeps the score. And here is an uncomfortable truth. Many women born in these decades confuse endurance with emotional maturity. They tolerate situations longer than they should. They explain behavior that hurts them. They wait for others to change, quietly, not because they are weak, but because leaving feels like failure. This is something no one warns you about. When you grow up learning to adapt, you forget that you are allowed to choose. Healing begins when attention turns inward, when empathy includes the self, when boundaries are not seen as cruelty, but as self-respect. And this shift is not easy, because it challenges a lifetime of conditioning, but it is necessary. There is another psychological layer I see often in women born in the 1970s and 1980s, and it rarely gets named out loud. It is grief, not for a person, but for a version of life that never fully happened. In my consultation, women sometimes say, almost apologetically, "I don't know why I feel sad. Nothing terrible happened, but something did happen." Or rather, something didn't. This generation was raised with responsibility before emotional freedom. You were expected to be sensible, realistic, practical. Dreams were allowed, but only if they were safe. From a psychological standpoint, this creates what we call postponed selfhood. Parts of you were delayed. Your curiosity, your playfulness, your emotional risk-taking. Neuroscience tells us that when desire and exploration are repeatedly postponed, the brain adapts by lowering expectation. You stop wanting too much. You stop imagining alternatives, not because you don't care, but because caring felt dangerous. This is why many women in their 40s and 50s suddenly feel restless. A vague dissatisfaction appears. A question arises quietly. Is this all? This is not a midlife crisis. It is emotional catching up. Your psyche is asking for space it never had. Another pattern I see is loyalty to emotional pain. Women stay attached to roles, relationships, or identities long after they have outgrown them. They say things like, "I can't just leave," or "This is who I am." But psychologically, loyalty that costs your vitality becomes self-betrayal. This generation was taught endurance as virtue. Leaving was framed as weakness. Starting over was framed as irresponsibility. So many women learn to shrink instead of change. And here's the part that is hard to hear. When you suppress growth for too long, depression doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as numbness. You function. You smile. You fulfill obligations. But joy feels distant. This is something no one warns you about. You can do everything right and still feel unfulfilled. Healing at this stage is not about radical upheaval. It's about gentle honesty. Asking yourself questions you were never encouraged to ask. What do I want now? What am I allowed to outgrow? Where have I been loyal to pain? These questions feel uncomfortable because they challenge decades of identity. But discomfort here is not danger. It is awakening. And this is where real psychological growth begins. There is a relationship pattern I see repeatedly in women born in the 1970s and 1980s, and it often surprises them when we finally name it. They confuse emotional intensity with emotional safety. In my consultation, women will describe relationships that were exhausting, unpredictable, or emotionally draining, and yet deeply hard to leave. They say things like, "I've never felt so connected," or "It felt real," or "I can't explain why I stayed." What most people don't realize is that the nervous system does not distinguish between familiarity and health. It only recognizes patterns it has learned before. Many women from this generation grew up in environments where emotional stability was inconsistent. Love came with conditions. Affection depended on mood, stress, or sacrifice. So the brain learned to associate closeness with emotional effort. From a neuropsychological perspective, this wires attachment to unpredictability. Dopamine spikes during emotional highs. Cortisol activates during emotional uncertainty. Together, they create intensity, not security. And intensity can feel like love when calm was never modeled. This is why emotionally stable partners may feel boring at first. The absence of drama feels unfamiliar. The nervous system waits for the drop that never comes. I often tell women gently, peace can feel empty before it feels safe. Another pattern is overfunctioning in relationships. You explain. You fix. You emotionally carry both sides, not because you enjoy it, but because being needed feels like belonging. This is something no one warns you about. When your worth is tied to usefulness, love becomes work. Over time, this leads to emotional burnout. You give until resentment replaces affection. You stay until numbness replaces desire. And then guilt appears. because you were taught that leaving means failing. Psychologically, many women in this generation also struggle with boundaries, not because they don't understand them, but because boundaries were never respected in their formative years. So saying no triggers anxiety. Choosing yourself triggers shame. Rest triggers self-criticism. Your nervous system learned that self-abandonment equals safety. Healing here is not about blaming the past. It's about retraining your attachment system. Learning that consistency is not dull, that calm is not absence, that love does not require suffering. This shift is slow. Because the brain resists unfamiliar peace. But every time you choose emotional safety over intensity, you teach your nervous system a new language. And that language changes everything. There is a physical dimension to the psychology of women born in the 1970s and 1980s that is often misunderstood or dismissed. The body has been speaking for years, long before the mind was ready to listen. In my consultation, women frequently arrive with symptoms that don't show clear medical causes. Chronic fatigue, tension in the neck and shoulders, sleep that never feels restorative, a constant sense of being on edge. What most people don't realize is that long-term emotional suppression reshapes the nervous system. When emotions are repeatedly held back, the body becomes the container. Neuroscience calls this somatic memory. Experiences that were never fully processed emotionally are stored physically. The body remembers what the mind learned to ignore. This generation learned to push through, to override discomfort, to keep going no matter what. That works for survival, but it exhausts the system. Many women from this era live in a state of functional freeze. They are not collapsing. They are not panicking. They are simply never fully relaxed. The parasympathetic nervous system, the part responsible for rest and repair, struggles to activate. Rest feels unsafe. Stillness feels uncomfortable. Silence feels loud. This is why so many women say, "I can't sit still," or "I feel restless even when nothing is wrong." Your body was trained to stay alert. Another common pattern is guilt around self-care. Even when time is available, enjoyment feels undeserved. Relaxation feels selfish. Slowing down feels like letting others down. This is not personality. This is conditioning. Women from this generation were taught to earn rest, not receive it. And here is a difficult truth I share carefully in therapy. If your body has been in survival mode for decades, it will resist healing at first. Not because healing is wrong, but because calm feels unfamiliar. This is something no one warns you about. Recovery can feel uncomfortable before it feels good. Small practices matter here. Not dramatic life changes, but moments of safety. Letting the body experience calm without explanation or justification. Because healing for this generation is not about fixing what is broken. It is about convincing the nervous system that the danger has passed. And that takes patience, gentleness, and permission. Permission you were rarely given. When women born in the 1970s and 1980s finally begin to understand their inner patterns, something subtle but profound happens. They stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What happened to me?" In my consultation, this is often the turning point, the moment when self-judgment softens into self-recognition. This generation carries a quiet wisdom. You have lived through cultural shifts, relational changes, technological revolutions. You learned to adapt again and again. But adaptation came at a cost. What most people don't realize is that maturity does not mean emotional completion. You can be competent, responsible, insightful, and still emotionally unfinished. And that is not a failure. It is a consequence of timing. You were raised to survive first, to feel later. Psychologically, the work now is integration, allowing the emotional self to catch up with the capable self, letting the parts of you that were postponed finally speak. This is why many women at this stage feel drawn to solitude, reflection, or quieter pleasures. It's not withdrawal, it's recalibration. Your nervous system is no longer interested in proving strength. It wants truth. It wants peace. There is also a deep fear many women carry, but rarely admit. If I stop being strong, will I still be loved? This fear was learned early. When love felt conditional, when approval followed sacrifice. But here is something I tell women gently and often. You do not have to earn rest. You do not have to justify boundaries. You do not have to suffer to deserve connection. This is something no one warned you about. The second half of life asks different questions than the first. Not how much can I carry, but what am I allowed to put down? Healing now is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is choosing honesty over habit. Presence over performance. Self-respect over self-sacrifice. You may never get back the softness you needed earlier, but you can give it to yourself now. And that matters more than you think. Because when a woman from this generation finally feels safe inside her own body, her own boundaries, her own truth, she doesn't become weaker.